Okay, welcome to this panel on a round table, I should say, without the table. We are in a circle, which is nice. We really appreciate you coming. We've titled this "The Self at War: What Historians Can Not learn about conflict from ego documents," which we've defined very broadly to mean any sort of source that's revealing, that's written by an individual, sort of revealing of the self. And this idea was hatched by Whitney Walton and me a few years ago at French Historical Studies in Los Angeles. We were both interested in using memoirs and letters to talk about the history and memory of the Napoleonic period, and we've sort of kept in touch about that. And then when we saw that the theme for this conference was conflicts, we thought it would be a nice occasion to think a little bit more broadly about how to use these sorts of sources for thinking about how to narrate or reconstruct the history of war. So that was the idea, and we thought we'd keep it relatively informal, and so I'm going to introduce everyone all at once, and we're going to try to keep presentations, or really just sort of remarks, to 10 to 15 minutes, so that we have plenty of time at the end for discussion by everyone. So I'm Christine Haynes. I teach at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, and I am currently working on a book project having to do with the occupation of France at the end of the Napoleonic Wars from 1815 to 1818, for which I've been using a variety of kinds of, what we are calling ego documents. And so that's sort of how I came to this. We're going to go in chronological order. Whitney Walton is going to begin. She is professor of history at Purdue University. Ranging widely across the 19th and the 20th centuries, she has published several books as well as numerous articles and chapters on such topics as French industry at the World's Fairs, women writers in Republican politics, and internationalism and study abroad. Her most recent book is Internationalism, National Identities and Study Abroad, France and the United States, 1890 to 1970, published by Stanford in 2010. And she's now embarking on a new project on memoirs by women of the Napoleonic era. Rachel Krastel is Associate Professor of History at Xavier University in Cincinnati, Ohio. She is the author of two books related to military history between the Franco-Prussian War and the Great War. The first was Organizing for War, France, 1870 to 1914, published by Louisiana State University Press in 2010. And the more recent, just out this year is the publication date, right? Wonderfully narrated book called The Siege of Strasburg, which recounts the history of the Siege of Strasburg during the Franco-Prussian War, published by Harvard University Press. She's now switching gears following that project to investigate the history of childlessness as a concept and experience, and I think she's still a little uncertain about geographical and chronological scope, but I think from basically in the modern period, 19th and maybe also 20th centuries. Rick Fogarty is who I must give special thanks to for joining us at the last minute when we found out that Martha Hanna, who was originally going to be on the roundtable, was not able to attend. We reached out to Rick, and he nicely agreed to participate just a couple of weeks ago, so we really appreciate him being here, especially given all of the events that are going on here and abroad, and I know he's been involved with a lot of them having to do with the centennial of the First World War. Richard S. Fogarty is Associate Professor of History and Associate Dean for General Education at the University at Albany State University of New York. He earned his PhD in History at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and is the author of Race and War in France, Colonial Subjects in the French Army, 1914 to 1918, published by Johns Hopkins in 2008, which won a Phi Alpha Theta Best First Book Award. And he's also co-editor of Empires in World War I, Shifting Frontiers and Imperial Dynamics in a Global Conflict, published also this year. He's now working on a general history of France and its empire during the First World War, as well as a study of North African prisoners of war in Germany and the Ottoman Empire, with special attention to the place of Islam and Muslims in the wider military and ideological struggle in Europe and the Middle East, which sounds like a very fascinating project. Finally, Shannon Fogg, to my immediate left, received her PhD from the University of Iowa in 2003. She is now Associate Professor in the Department of History and Political Science at Missouri University of Science and Technology, where she has taught since 2004. She is the author of The Politics of Everyday Life in Vichy France, Foreigners, Undesirables, and Strangers, published by Cambridge University Press in 2009, which won the Missouri Conference on History Best Book Award in 2009, as well as numerous essays on the experiences of Jews, Gypsies, and other groups labeled outsiders by the Vichy regime during and after World War II. So we have a very distinguished panel ranging from the Napoleonic Wars to World War II, and I'm looking forward to hearing your comments about how you've used ego documents to reconstruct the history of conflict. So we'll start with Whitney, please.
Thank you. Also, I think it's important to give credit to Christine for pulling this together and for coming up with this terrific title, The Self at War, What Historians Can Not Learn About Conflict from Ego Documents. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. So, the ego documents that concern me are mostly published memoirs by women who lived through and recorded their experiences of the Revolution and Napoleon. Now, many scholars have examined these writings, and I will mention only a few in order to set up my own thoughts on the topic of this roundtable. Damienne Zanon's Écrire son temps, les mémoires en France de 1815 à 1848 of 2006 counts close to 400 eyewitness accounts published between 1815 and 1848. And he analyzes a broad selection of them as literary genre and commercial phenomenon. Zanon is interested in the dialogue among memoirists during this time. He also notes that authors and readers regarded memoirs as both history and autobiography, with attendant tensions between the recording of recent and turbulent history and the representation of an individual life. According to Zanon, many authors focused on details of Napoleon's life, since he was the dominant figure and of great historical importance, while some also aspired to correct errors in previously published works, and all denied any commercial or financial motivations for writing and publishing their memoirs. As Zanon and others, including Emmanuel de Varesquille, Pierre Serna, and Sudhir Hazare Singh, have noted, memoirists of this time period felt compelled to explain their responses to the different regimes under which they lived and often served. They had to reinvent themselves, especially after Napoleon fell from power, and they sought to survive and thrive under the Restoration. The trauma of the 100 Days alone generated many accounts of individuals who, and I am quoting Varesquille, felt a visceral need to reestablish a coherent vision of themselves for posterity. Acknowledging that eyewitnesses who considered themselves victims or outcasts felt especially compelled to justify themselves through reinvention, he claims that historians have wrongly ignored such accounts, and he proceeds to analyze their intentions and antagonisms, in other words, the conflicts that these individuals confronted and represented. So all these scholars focus primarily on memoirs by men, though they include several by women, notably Madame de Staël's Considérations sur la Révolution Française of 1818. And these scholars have taught us a lot about conflict. Individuals have many different ways of explaining their loyalties, principles, and actions during this period of political turbulence and violence. One thing that has not been addressed is gender in personal narratives that recount historical conflict at this time. I've read only a few of these narratives thus far, so my comments today are tentative and suggestive rather than definitive. But I would like to introduce some issues of personal morality, service to the state, domestic or familial responsibility, and patriotism that might be developed as gendered. Additionally, the legend of Napoleon might be a little different from some feminine perspectives, in contrast to what Hazare Singh has written. And perhaps this research can enhance historical understanding about Napoleon's and the Napoleonic era's impact on women and gender. A notable feature of some women's memoirs of the Revolution and Napoleon is an apologetic tone or defense of their going public with their stories. They appealed to readers' emotions through their own emotional responses to events. While both women and men justified the writing and, in most cases, publication of their memoirs in some way, often in order to correct errors that appeared in other accounts, women authors often excused themselves in ways that men usually did not. Laure Junot, the Duchesse d'Abrantès, for example, asserted that friends urged her to respond to erroneous representations of her husband, a loyal general to Napoleon, and that for a long time she resisted. And now I'm going to quote Junot. Refutation is never calm, it is almost always impassioned, and thus becomes ridiculous in a woman's mouth, unquote. But she finally relented and suggested that whereas such fears might have daunted a woman of the world, and she was indeed a prominent salonière during the Empire, such fears diminished for the widow, the daughter, and the mother. So interestingly, it is in her private and relational identities rather than a public identity that she feels comfortable addressing conflict in history, in her life, and with other memoirs. Queen Hortense asserted that as a public figure, she had been both overly praised and blamed. With her memoirs, she wanted to make herself better known to friends. And I quote her, "Here I am, judge me, pity me, I am true. Love me, esteem me, that is my heart's desire." End of quote. She wrote that it would be painful to recount the sad times of her life, but that perhaps she could take comfort in rediscovering, quote, "the little good that I could do." Unlike Junot and Queen Hortense, Madame de Rémusat did not publish her memoirs during her lifetime, and she claimed that her motivation to write was a compulsion. She wrote to her son that the publication of Madame de Staël's Considérations sur la Révolution Française in 1818 compelled her to write the memoirs of her service in Josephine's household that she had burned in 1815. So in a letter to her son Charles of May 27, 1818, Claire de Rémusat wrote that she, quote, felt consumed, or mordu, I wasn't quite sure how to translate that. She felt consumed with the need to speak of Bonaparte. Here I am telling of the death of the Duc d'Enghien, that terrible week that I spent at Malmaison, and since I am an emotional person, after writing a few lines, it seemed that I was back in those times. Facts and words returned to me on their own. I wrote 20 pages between yesterday and today, and that strongly moved me. With the notable exception of Madame de Staël, women understood their accounts of political and personal conflict differently than did most men. Elements of personal morality, family obligations, and unburdening of one's emotions precipitated taking up their pens. Another notable feature of these accounts is their instability and the suggestion of a fragmented rather than a coherent self in response to the many different conflicts the authors confronted. Laure Junot's memoir repeatedly jumps back and forth in time, and she is upfront about how the memories invoke other memories, so that she makes no claims to present a chronologically ordered account. In Volume 2, out of 16, I say, in Volume 2, she interjects, quote, I wish to speak of a kind of irregularity in several accounts, unquote, referring to an anecdote that occurred many years after the story she was telling about her husband, Junot. And then she continues, this flaw, if it is one, is due to the nature of these memoirs. They are memories evoked by memories. Touching one string makes 10 more vibrate, each of which renders a different tone. But for all that, they are no less in agreement and form no less of a complete harmony, unquote. Claire de Rémusat distinguished between herself when she was young, naive, and optimistic, and a more mature individual who regarded the persons and events around her with great apprehension. Writing in 1818 of the time she and her husband entered service in the First Consul's household in 1802, she declared, I cannot help thinking with a pang of anguish of the illusions I held then. I regret them as one regrets the happy thoughts of the springtime of one's life, of this time when, to use a comparison familiar to Bonaparte himself, one sees everything through a golden veil that makes them brilliant and light. Little by little, he said, this veil thickens as one moves forward until it becomes almost black. You gotta love this. Queen Hortense often vacillated between presenting herself as a fearless patriot and a weak and isolated woman. Writing about 1812, after the disastrous Russian campaign, she suggests that she was convinced that Napoleon would seek a peace treaty after another final victory, and she wrote, "I was so sure that one more combat would put an end to the hostilities that I definitely ordered the furniture of a room which I had been wanting for a long time after receiving news of the Battle of Lutzen." When the Austrian ambassador asked her if she could use her influence to persuade Napoleon that a peace treaty was necessary, she replied, "He obeys only the commands of public opinion, which become his own wishes. And my youth and my position as an obedient daughter have always prevented my offering him any advice." She really vacillates on this, but this, this is interesting. However, she did promise to write to her brother Eugene to speak firmly to Napoleon about peace. Similarly, in March 1814, when Allied troops approached Paris, she claimed to have tried to persuade Empress Marie-Louise to stay and rally people to defend the city. She says, "Only women know how to rise to the occasion," unquote. But even though several court ladies shared her view that if Paris could be held for one more day, Napoleon would arrive and save the city, she then wrote, "What could women alone and without experience do?" And so she departed Paris. Conflict presented itself in different ways to the authors. For some, the revolution disrupted family life and deprived them of a childhood. It is notable that many of these authors wrote their entire life stories, not just accounts of political crises. In this way, they invited presentation of a fragmented or changing self. Others thought Napoleon represented stability until they questioned the morality of some of his actions, notably the execution of the Duc d'Enghien. As women, they felt constrained in how to respond to political matters. They also felt obligations to family members. This is not to say they were helpless victims of circumstances. They were unable to serve their country as soldiers and political leaders, but they did exercise political influence when possible, and they performed patriotism in different ways. Queen Hortense indicates that she married Louis Bonaparte out of a sense of sacrifice, to save her mother's marriage to Napoleon and to serve her country, since Napoleon wished her to marry his brother so that he could adopt the children of their union. Claire de Rémusat wrote that she and her husband initially admired Napoleon and were grateful to him for establishing stability and security in France. Because of her mother's connections with Josephine, Napoleon offered positions to both of them after the revolution wiped out their fortune, and they had no other prospects. And so I'm going to quote Claire de Rémusat about this time. "When he became consul, everyone breathed. Initially, he seized confidence. Little by little, occasions for anxiety occurred, but we were employed, we were committed. Finally, generous souls who had believed in him started to shudder, and he led true citizens to wish for his downfall, even at the risk of the losses this would bring to them. This is our story, Monsieur de Rémusat's and mine. There is nothing humiliating about it, for it is honorable to be reassured when the country breathes, and later to wish its deliverance above else. No one will ever know what I suffered during the last years of Bonaparte's tyranny." End of quote. These women authors expressed loyalty to France and responsibility to their families. When circumstances changed, so did they. Some admitted their mistakes, and all invited readers to share and sympathize with their sorrows. They had important information to convey about Napoleon, especially his private or intimate life, and about French history and conflict. While the accounts by women close to Napoleon may have humanized him, as Hazarizing asserts about Las Casas' Memorial de Saint-Hélène, they did not necessarily liberalize him. Their accounts reflected their conflicted views about Napoleon and the conflict they experienced and witnessed in their lifetimes.
So I decided to take a very different approach to this issue and to talk about the craft of writing using these different ego documents. The book that Christine mentioned, The Siege of Strasburg, came out just this past spring, so I thought I'd share a few passages from it. It draws very heavily on diaries and memoirs filled with rich details, some of them mundane, some idiosyncratic, some serious, some humorous, and they provide different perspectives on some of the same events. These sources shape both the narrative and the analysis of the book, and here I'd like to explore some of the challenges I had in bringing these voices all together, some of the techniques used, some things that I didn't really even realize until I had the opportunity now to reflect on it. So that's very helpful, and I hope that we can have a conversation on how we actually write. So first, introducing a voice. How to make clear that this voice is important and should be remembered by the reader, and that one is maybe less significant as a character. This was the issue for one narrator that I had throughout the book, a librarian and artist named Frédéric Piton. He wrote a history of Strasburg in the early 1850s and drew a 360-degree panorama of the city that he drew from atop the cathedral. It was a really wonderful source. And he kept a siege diary in 1870. But he didn't play a clear role in the siege, so I was afraid he would get lost to the reader because he's not a politician, he's not a general. So I decided to use him to start the very first chapter. And I'll read just a paragraph here. On July 12, 1870, 70-year-old Frédéric Piton wrote a personal letter to Emperor Napoleon III. Alarmed at rumors that France was preparing to declare war on Prussia, Piton sought to register his disapproval. He opened with a formal introduction in which he presented his many loyalties and experiences. Quote, "As an elderly man, loving humanity and the patrie above all, a citizen involved with the political agitation of this century, a state employee having taken an oath to the government, and an Alsatian, I believe it is my duty to present to your majesty the present supplication." End quote. Bookbinder, artist, and librarian, Piton straddled Strasbourg's many divides. A civilian living in a fortress city, a craftsman who moved in intellectual circles, a Freemason steeped in Strasbourg's religious heritage, a Protestant who frequented the Catholic cathedral, an Alsatian speaker who could write in French, and a loyal Frenchman who also respected his neighbors across the Rhine in Baden. Piton was adept at negotiating the gray areas. And so I use Piton to frame not only so now he's introduced and I hope the reader will remember him, but he also frames the subject of the chapter, which is the gray areas in Strasbourg, that it's a lot more complicated a city than we might expect. And then he closes the chapter as well. So by this point, I hope he's established. Now another voice I had that had a little trick was came from a 60-page handwritten narrative of the siege anonymously. And it was written by a woman who was regretting the fact that she had decided to stay in the city with her husband and her 2 small children. So she was a wonderful source, one of the few voices I have by women, in fact, from this siege. But it was too clunky to call her the anonymous woman, the anonymous mother, through like a 250-page narrative. So I decided to give her a name. I just said, you know what, I'm giving her a name, and I make it clear when I do it. I call her Catherine Weiss, a French first name and a German last name. I felt vindicated by that choice a few months later when I was going through lists of people who died during the siege, and I actually came across someone named Catherine Weiss. And I said, oh no, she died! And I realized, no, I just fooled myself, of course. That was somebody else. Okay, so then what do we do with these voices? Well, of course, sometimes they are the only people to witness something. Sometimes they're throwing in some idiosyncrasy. And idiosyncrasies can be really great, right? They can, for instance, there's a young historian named Rodolphe Royce who comes in a lot. And at one day he's walking through the streets and he sees a church in flames and he's distraught. And then he realizes, oh no, it's actually just a swarm of gnats that has left. It's not smoke at all. So he's relieved. So I chose idiosyncrasies that are visual and that can maybe be a little bit humorous. Those are the ones to keep, right? I mean, there's so many things. You have to choose what to keep and what to leave out. That's the basic essential thing about writing, right? and so visual and humor, I think, are what to keep. Now, of course, there are other times when one person is in an event. They're the only witness to the event. You have no idea whether, what they're experiencing is really how it went down. But you want to make some kind of analytical point. So I think that's really useful. So for instance, Weiss, or whatever her name actually was, she actually managed to leave the city about 2/3 of the way through the siege with her children, and she describes her confrontations with some of the German soldiers on her way out. Several miles further at the next checkpoint, Weiss encountered more resistance. Since she was unexpectedly traveling by foot, she now needed another day of safe passage to make it out of the combat zone. The Prussians refused. She was told to continue on during the night. She replied, or at least she says she replied, "I will stay here despite you. I will not continue my voyage tomorrow. Maybe that will be your vengeance, but I am staying here and I will stay this time until the opening of the city." End quote. Her brisk, dramatic reply, quote, had its effect, and the Prussians gave way. This is the strongest example of Weiss's self-assertion in her entire account of the siege, her clearest moment of self-dramatization and effectiveness, though it came at the cost of suffering the indignity of the Prussians' condescension. Quote, "He asked for my passport and put his mark on it, laughing. Me, I was hardly disposed to gaiety, and I promptly left." So again, I have no idea if this is how the confrontation went, but it served an analytical point for me because I was trying to make an argument about self-efficacy, about well-being, and that well-being entails some kind of like sense of being able to take control of one's actions. And so this is one little piece of that argument. Another example comes from Royce again, the young historian and teacher who did in fact witness not just the not actually burning of a church, but another major Protestant church and library that was destroyed. And he's all too aware of his moment in history when he then describes sobs rising in his chest and his newfound hatred for the German culture. He writes this. He took comfort in the belief that, quote, "Europe and the civilized world of the future would note under the deceptive varnish of this intellectual culture," the German, "of which they showed themselves so proud, the native barbarism of a race where at all times and most often without shame, might makes right," end quote. However devastating the loss today, however vast the hole in civilization appeared, it remained a constant whose values of scholarship, books, and the continuity of knowledge would endure and pass judgment. I have to admit, I feel a little bit manipulated by him because I feel like I am a historian who is now like writing this story about the destruction and that, but that's okay. I think that's all right. Because here too, I'm making a point of his faith in civilization is evidence of the gap that he saw, the gap between, or that I see really, between civilian expectations for war on the one hand, of that civilians should be protected, civilization should be protected, and on the other hand, their actual experience. A gap that early humanitarians tried to fulfill just a few weeks later when they come into Strasburg and perform one of the very first, if not the first, international intervention to bring people out of this besieged city. Now, beyond the lone observer, I see three major uses of ego documents in an ensemble piece. First, setting a scene. Selecting that key scene, that scene that brings a lot of the different threads of the story together, such as the moment when the white flag unfurled atop the cathedral, signaling the end of the siege. I could set the scene with a variety of voices and perspectives, moving through time and space as the documents I had allowed me to move through time and space. That was a fun thing to do. Second, something we do all the time, of course, is triangulation, providing different perspectives on the same thing. So having someone like the outsider Weiss is useful to provide those other perspectives. I could triangulate between the French general's memoir and the actual documents that I saw in the archives in Vincennes and say that he was missing a few things here and there, and so on. And third, and maybe a little more controversially, is to use these different characters as archetypes. That is, characterizations that would allow us to explore an aspect of the siege. And this is not something I did a lot, but in one particular chapter, this is in the chapter when they're debating the right moment to surrender, I chose to use three different individuals to stand in for different perspectives on the siege. A general, a politician, and you might call a maverick, one of Gambetta's prefects who was appointed and then sneaks into the city. He's dodging bullets, he's swimming across the river, he's in disguise, he's a great guy. Very interesting. So I take those three, the general, the politician, and the maverick, to symbolize three different attitudes toward capitulation. We should follow the rules and customs of when to surrender, says the general. We should surrender to avoid any further destruction, says the politician. And third, we should hold on to the last extremity, until the last, thing burns down, and that's the maverick. And by extension, they represent three different ethical traditions as well. Deontology, that is to say, we derive action from principles. Second, consequentialism, what will be the consequences of holding out? And third, virtue ethics, what kind of a person am I? I'm going to hold on to the last extremity. Now, I recognize this is really problematic, right? I mean, these are complicated people. They have many different views on this, and these are complicated decisions. But the way that they portray them, right? I mean, we might think that we make decisions for all kinds of idiosyncratic and irrational reasons in the moment, but when we're writing about them later, we tell a story about them. And so it's that storytelling that I wanted to bring out to make a point about different philosophical traditions that could be really abstract into something very, very concrete. And so that was my hope for that chapter. So 2 final points. Bringing characters to a conclusion. I have the characters bow out one at a time, again making an analytical point about the very different choices that people had in Strasburg after they were taken by the Germans. So do they go? Do they become French? Do they become German? And so that's my opportunity to little very short paragraph about what their lives were like later. And then finally, I'd just like to make the point that since in this particular case I was telling the story of an event, it was relatively straightforward, at least in retrospect. It seems that way. It doesn't always seem easier, after you finish writing something. It was to select the order, to make choices of what to keep and what to leave out. For my new project on childlessness, as Christine brought up before, it's not so easy, and I'm not sure exactly what the project will look like. And I'm realizing now why that is, because I have memoirs of childless people. They're autobiographies, and I don't yet have the ability to hang them on. And so I'm concerned that these ego documents will only play the role of examples or idiosyncrasies, and I think that will make the narrative a little more problematic. And so I would welcome any suggestions on how I might approach that problem. Thank you.